Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the In a Nutshell podcast here on the Sports Daily Media Network YouTube channel. This is episode 79. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. I got Joe Meade with me today. And Joe, it's been a while since we've done just a Big Ten basketball episode. So we're going to put the standings up here on the right. Michigan State and Michigan top of the league at 3-0. But Joe, first, we're each going to give a team that we are impressed by. So, Joe, pick one out of the pack here that maybe has played a little bit better than we expected since we last talked.
Sean, I know I've been high on their praises most of the year, but I'm gonna pick Michigan State. I think since Maui, this has been one of the sleeper teams in all of college basketball, just the way they've played. And I know a lot of people are gonna call out that they haven't beaten anyone that significant. Beating Minnesota and Nebraska and Ohio State in conference isn't anything to scoff at. But this is a team, Sean. When you look at their January schedule, I wouldn't look at their February schedule, particularly if you're a Spartan. But if you look at that January schedule, this is a team that can very realistically get to 15 or 16 wins by the end of the month. They have Washington at Northwestern, Penn State, Illinois at Rutgers, and Minnesota. Of those 6 games remaining, I bet you they're favored in 5 of those 6. And maybe the one that they're not is Illinois, and even then, that's at the Breslin. So I wouldn't rule out a win there at all. With all that said, Sean, I don't think they've been doing anything different than when we checked in with them in December. They're kind of riding Jaden Akins. They're doing the second spot by committee a lot, and they found this lineup. No one has to score that efficiently outside of Akins, and even when he doesn't, they have other guys picking up, like Simone Zapala, who most of us thought the transfer from Longwood. We didn't think he was going to get much playing time, if any, this year, and he was a huge factor in their win at Ohio State, a game I thought they kind of let slip away in the middle of it, but they really rallied, and that's been a theme we've seen with a lot of teams. And Cohen Carr off the bench, Xavier Booker's a lot better off the bench as well. And even when Jace Richardson, their star freshman, when he doesn't play well, it doesn't matter. This Spartan team has about, I really think, 9 guys that can beat you, and probably 9 guys that you could plug and play in their starting lineup and play 20 to 30 a game, and it won't matter. So I think Izzo's got something cooking. I'm not going to really say they're the favorite right now, but they'd have to be in the top 4 at least.
And Joe, I think I mentioned this last time about how balanced their scoring is. 9 players averaging 6 points per game. That is extremely important. I mean, you got almost 2 units worth of players that are averaging 2 or 3 buckets a game. And they've just been going very under the radar. I know they haven't played, they played a couple teams down there at the bottom of the table, but Nebraska, they beat by 37. And the Cornhuskers have not lost since, and they're going to be my impressive team in a minute, Joe. But I think we talked about Michigan State's range of outcomes being among the closer. We know they're going to be solid, probably 12, 13 wins in the league. And if they start to make threes, then maybe we can talk about Final Four. But, Joe, at this point, they're really good. There is no elite team in this conference, so they might just end up at the top of the pile at 13-7 or 14-6.
It's very probable.
All right, Joe. Up next, my impressive team is going to be the team that they beat, and that's Nebraska. It's just been a different type of team since that performance. They still have that really nice win against Creighton from earlier in the year. They bounced back from that Michigan State loss with a big win against Indiana. They go to Hawaii. They win the Diamond Head. They beat UCLA at home, and they are currently on the road at Iowa, winning just before halftime. But, Joe, with how much talent they lost last year and how little talent we thought they had coming in, you have to be pretty impressed with Nebraska here, as they are probably an Iowa win away from being on the top 25. They're in a good spot to make the tournament again, and they're playing really good basketball.
Absolutely, Sean. I think really, I hate to bring this up in front of you. I really think that game against Indiana probably ignited a spark in this team, because since then, they've been on that win streak, Sean. And this is a team that did do work for themselves at the beginning of the year. That road win at Creighton was huge. That's going to pay dividends throughout the year. And we called it out immediately. We said, if Nebraska can even be close to the tournament, that win might be what puts them over the edge. And the way they're playing now, I don't know whether they'll finish this game out at Iowa. I know a lot of you are going to listen to this after Michigan plays UCLA and after Iowa plays Nebraska on Peacock. But regardless, Sean, there's plenty of opportunities throughout this schedule. And with the way they've looked on the road outside of the Michigan State game, and, I can't believe I didn't bring up the UCLA game. Winning that game's huge. I know Eric Daly Jr. was out, but
They were deserving of that W, though.
but I don't know if he would have been much of a factor either. I think the entire second half, they really were superior to UCLA. I thought Fred Hoiberg outcoached Mick Cronin to a large degree in that game as well. He got those guys a lot of good-looking shots, even when the three ball wasn't necessarily clicking. So I'd say Fred Hoiberg, I'm not going to bet against him. Since we've been doing this podcast, he's done nothing but overperform pretty low expectations at Nebraska. So
Yeah, and they're able to win. Obviously, they're able to beat UCLA with Connor Segan putting up nothing. He's been good this year, but they're not very reliant on big games from anybody except for Bryce Williams. And Joe, in our last midseason awards episode with Mike, we both actually picked him for Big Ten midseason player of the year so far. It's been a league with a ton of good players. He's certainly headed towards the first team at this point if Nebraska, comes anywhere close to the top of the league. But Joe, these two away games at Iowa, which is ongoing right now, and at Purdue, they do have a little bit of a easier couple games here. You get Rutgers, Maryland, USC, Wisconsin. There's some wins in there. And again, the teams that they play twice, they get to see Maryland twice. They get to see Ohio State twice. It's just they get to see Minnesota. There's wins on the schedule for Nebraska. As from what we know now and where we think these teams are at, I think their schedule might end up on the easier side of things with who they've got twice, who they've got at home. And they're a team that is definitely in a much better position than we thought. Probably even just last time we talked. But Nebraska's been impressive, and so has Michigan State, really. All right, Joe, let's turn it around the other way. Go for a team that you've not been impressed by and that you think that we should be seeing a little bit more from.
The first one, and I hope I didn't take yours away, Sean, is Rutgers.
That's the easy one, yep.
I think since the break, they've been kind of lucky to win a lot of these games, to be honest. I'm really including the Seton Hall game, even the Penn State game. We said, hey, it was just good to rebound, and Penn State is appearing in a lot of bracketology, so beating any tournament team in the Big Ten, that's no easy task. I wasn't going to fault them for that until I saw them play against Seton Hall and I saw them play against Rutgers. Until I saw them play against Seton Hall and Princeton. Those kind of back-to-back games.
Yeah, we did talk about that Princeton game being a potential trap game, and I don't think it was that, Joe. I think Princeton was the better team on the floor, and they ended up with the W.
Yeah, and then to parlay that into the win against Columbia, and then, losing at Assembly Hall, and then losing at home to Wisconsin. I thought that was a big game for both those teams. To be honest with you, had Wisconsin lost that game, I would have been pretty worried about them starting 1-3 in Big Ten play. Not necessarily faltering by any means. I think they're in a decent spot for the tournament. More so that it would be a pattern we've seen before in the guard era. But getting off Wisconsin, Sean, you have to take into account the Harper injury. But this is a team that takes wild shots offensively. There's no real direction. And defensively, I think it's safe to say they've regressed to a large degree.
Yeah, there's a larger conversation here about Rutgers, Joe. But first off, they're really not good without Dylan Harper. He didn't play at Assembly Hall, and Ace Bailey had 39 points. I don't think Indiana guarded him particularly poorly either. Nobody did anything else. It was almost like it was a pickup basketball offense from Rutgers. And, but their defense is something that has taken a step back. And, Joe, from the point of view of Rutgers over the years, really since Peichel took over, is that they're really pesky defensively, and if they can make some shots, they'll be really dangerous. They really haven't had much talent at all since they joined the Big Ten, and they finally get that this year, and it seems like that gritty culture of toughness is gone, and it's kind of unfortunate to see, obviously, for Rutgers fans, and as a neutral, this is not the same Rutgers team that we've seen that can beat. Did I lose you, Joe? You back?
God. Yep, I caught up.
All right, we're back. Sorry about that. Joe, we were talking about Rutgers and how their culture of toughness is kind of gone, and it's unfortunate because it's the first year where they've really had a lot of talent.
Yeah, and I don't know if I want to make that assessment in early January because that's exactly where we are. And this is a team that could easily flip it around and go into February and March with their hair on fire. And in a way, this could be like some Michigan teams we see in the past, like Caleb Houston and Musa Diabate, where they just got it together, uh, albeit kind of in a fire drill way, where they had to win like 6 of their last 8 games, or plenty of other teams we've seen, like the Wisconsin 2016 team. But Sean, that's not really how I envision this going for Rutgers. I think they're gonna pick off a ton of people at home, but I don't think they'll be able to pick off as many people on the road. And should Bailey or Harper get injured or not play well, I don't think they can rely on their defense the same way. So it's certainly gonna be a very challenging task to get back onto the bubble for Rutgers, but this conference provides no shortage of opportunities for it.
Yeah, at this point, Joe, I think the tournament is really kind of out of reach, barring a automatic bid. And I think at this point, we do need to be worried about them not even making the Big Ten tournament. This year, the new rule, 15 teams of the 18 will be going to the Big Ten tournament. And essentially, it is the same thing as before. There's just an extra Wednesday game. It'll be the 10-15 will be the first game on Wednesday, and then the other two as usual. But Joe, it's just unfortunate. You know, they've had, frankly, a couple teams that weren't very good, but they were still better than this. And, you know, once the season gets closer to the end, Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey are both going to be drafted very high in the NBA draft. Did their focus turn to that? I mean, probably. But Rutgers certainly on the downward trend right now. Joe, I'm going to go with a team here for my pick that started off the season amazing, and this is disappointing since the last time we talked basketball on here, and that's the Oregon Ducks. They are have 2 losses in a row at home in the Big Ten. They lost to Michigan. No, they didn't. They lost to UCLA at home, sorry, and then they lost to Illinois by a significant margin, 109-77. They did bounce back with a nice win against Maryland in a game that really could have gone either way. But, Joe, we talked about Oregon maybe getting lucky to win all those games early on, a bunch of close ones, and it seems like it is starting to even out a little bit. This team that was ranked up in the top 10 is probably more so in the 15 to 30 range in the country.
Absolutely, Sean, and really the run of form they've been on. They've gone from probably a team a lot of people thought was going to win the conference to perhaps a team that's going to be fighting to just be playing on Thursday uh, when the tournament goes to Indianapolis. One factor I don't think we've really considered a lot is whether their out-of-conference schedule was that tough. I mean, the Texas A&M win, the Alabama win aged pretty well. But since then, Sean, it's pretty impossible to ignore their run. And let's face it, beating USC and beating Stanford don't really move the needle for anyone. So perhaps we just overrated this team, and they're probably a solid team, but to rank them in the top 10 like they were at times might have been a little overzealous on a lot of people's parts.
Yeah, the next 2 games are big for them, Joe. At Ohio State, at Penn State. 2, probably bubble teams at this point. Penn State's in pretty good shape. Ohio State maybe outside looking in at this point. But these are the sorts of away games that average Big Ten teams will lose. And these are the sorts of games where good Big Ten teams that get the double bye win at least one. And I think if you're Oregon at this point, I think you probably do take 1 out of 2 here, because then you get Oregon, Washington, you are Oregon. You get Purdue at home and then Washington and Minnesota. So you'd think that you could take care of business in those games if you can just get out of here 1-1. But these are the sorts of things that make the Big Ten so tough. Bubble teams on the road, I mean, they should be underdogs at least to Penn State.
Yeah, and to split that would be a massive victory. And go 0 for 2 would be not a disaster, but I wouldn't necessarily want to bake their following games on having to produce results, because after that it goes Purdue, Washington at Minnesota at UCLA. And for anyone who knows about Ohio State and Minnesota's game last night, I know a lot of people are going to call out the obvious choke by Minnesota, but that should give you even more caution because, had they not fouled there, Ohio State would have had to make a half-court three to avoid a quad three loss. So that's a game that provides very little benefit to any team when you play Minnesota or Washington.
And Joe, I think we are not quite there yet, but we are starting to enter the it matters when you play teams zone. Ohio State obviously got away with that against Minnesota, but they're still in a desperate spot where they probably need a big win to get them back on the right side of the bubble. Penn State just lost a game at home to Indiana. We'll see what happens before they play then. And then you turn it around, Joe, if they do go 0 for 2 on their road trip, Purdue, they're going to host Purdue on a Saturday afternoon crowd. Purdue certainly doesn't want them to go 0-2 on this road trip because they're going to be desperate there. So I think this league is going to be very timing based on what happens in these matchups. Scheduling obviously makes a big deal. With only 3 repeat opponents, I think it's a little bit less. Like most teams will play other teams once, and there'll be a couple twos, but maybe not time to schedule a watch yet. But I know this for sure. This Big Ten season is going to be a roller coaster. I think every fan base is going to be liking where their team's at one point, and then probably not at one point too. But starting to see a little bit of the roller coaster here from Oregon. They've seen the highs, and for their sake, let's hope that they've seen the lows.
1,000%, Sean.
All right, Joe. Well, we've got a couple more minutes here. There are a couple other teams that we do want to talk about, and your team is in action tonight. And I would guess that if you're listening to this, you've already seen what happens in Los Angeles. But Joe, this is leg 2 of the LA road trip. Your Wolverines did get the job done against USC, so at the very minimum, they are leaving with 1 win. And despite USC finishing likely towards the bottom of the conference, UCLA likely headed towards the top. Either way, as long as this UCLA game isn't a total disaster, I would think Michigan would probably take 1 out of 2 on this road trip. Either way.
I think so, Sean. One thing Michigan's done in the last few weeks, especially even in that Oklahoma loss, even after that Oklahoma loss, is they've shot the 3 a lot better. I think they've ridden Danny Wolf and Vlad Golden quite a lot, probably a little too much toward the beginning part of the year. And that's why you saw them lose these close games against both Arkansas and Oklahoma. Those games came down to the buzzer, and unfortunately for Michigan, those teams made big shots. All those big shots happened to be threes. Michigan's a team that can get to the basket when it wants to. They could get a lot of high percentage shots. This is a team that hasn't shot the 3 ball well, and I think in the first half, seeing Damari Burnett and Trey Donaldson hit threes the way they did really raises the ceiling of this team. Do I think they're Big Ten frontrunners? Probably not. I think a lot of the media and certainly Vegas thinks that. I know they're second in the odds as we record this on Tuesday night here, but I do think this team still has a long way to go, especially because they still turn the ball over too damn much. So the one thing they really have riding for them, and I'm going to give a pro and a con, is the good part is they have a lot of quad 2 wins. The con is they only have 1 quad 1 win. They missed a lot of good opportunities against Oklahoma and Arkansas, both games that probably should have been won by Michigan, to be honest with you. But luckily, they don't have that quad 3 or 4 loss that'll sink them. So right now, you're seeing them in a lot of 6 seeds, 7 seeds in brackets. I think it's a tad too early to project that way, but this is a team that probably to get to that, real top, like to be a top 4 seed or maybe into the top 16, they got to win games like at UCLA, and they can't slip up in their coming games, which are both quad 3 or 4 games against Washington and Minnesota. So certainly, I think the ceiling's been raised on Michigan, but until they figure out the turnover part, I don't think they're a top 15 team.
I think 15 to 25 is probably about right for them. I think I don't. There's not much to worry about extra than the already problems from those two losses to Arkansas and Oklahoma. Those teams are pretty good, and I think you got pretty good performances from them too. But this UCLA win, a win here, Joe, for you against UCLA would put them in a really good spot to sort of rattle off a couple wins. You get Washington at home, Minnesota on the road, Northwestern at home. You would think that Michigan would be heavily favored in all three of those games before the trip to Mackey on the 24th. But teams have got to attack these soft spots in their schedule because there's not many of them. I think other than Minnesota, Washington, and USC, Joe, you'd have to think the home team. You wouldn't be surprised if the home team won any of these games,
No,
the rest of the way.
absolutely not. And even USC and Minnesota are dangerous games, has to be mentioned.
And USC has a lot of talent and a lot of players that can score, and they're capable of winning, but metrically they're going to finish near the bottom of the conference in wins and losses too. All right, Joe. Well, my team isn't doing so bad either right now. They picked up a nice 77-71 win over Penn State at the Palestra on Sunday. That comes after a 10-point win against the Fighting Ace Baileys. And Joe, all of a sudden, Indiana is 12-3. Malik Reneau does go down with an injury, but on the heels of that, they've put up their two best defensive efforts of the season. So, Joe, is it sort of a trending in the right direction motto here from Indiana?
I don't know if it's necessarily a motto. I would say that Penn State game was a huge factor. They were obviously not favored. I believe they were, 5.5, 6.5 point dogs.
I think it ended up being closer to 8.
Wow.
Yeah. Depending on where you got it, but yeah.
Yeah, so depending on where you bet that, being that big a favorite in a practical road game, I know Hoosier fans showed out at the end, but in a practical road game to get that, that's a huge quad one win for Indiana. They really lacked those, I felt, throughout November and December. And, I thought the Nebraska trip certainly could have been a fork in the road in their season. And right now they've got back on track. I think the next 4 games are pretty interesting. I think you definitely have to win the USC ones. And then you have then you have at Iowa, home against Illinois, at Ohio State, at Northwestern. So the next 5, I think if Indiana can win 2 or 3, they're certainly in a good position for the tournament, I'd say, considering most of those would be quad 1 wins with the exception of of USC at home, excuse me. But we have to see more consistency, Sean. We know Indiana's capable of playing well. We know about the 2 big scenario, which I'm going to let you get into. We know they have a bunch of talent. Now, at this stage, they have to figure it out. Because it's January, all these games are going to matter now. And you can't slip up against one of these bad teams. They don't have a bad one for a while. But come February, when they do play... they do avoid Minnesota and
they
Washington.
already played Minnesota and beat them, and then they only get Washington, I think it's near the end of the year on the road. Yeah. So not getting them twice, potentially good. Joe, I think it's just going to come down to, does Indiana get enough wins? I mean, there probably is 10 wins in the Big Ten of a viable goal right now. I think so. That would put them at 22-10 heading into the Big Ten tournament. If you beat the right teams, that's definitely enough to get into the tournament. This Reneau injury is a little bit mysterious. Woodson, before the game against Penn State, when ruling Reneau out, says, it's not going to be very long. This game, maybe one more. And then yesterday on his radio show, he said it's going to be a little bit until Reneau comes back. So at least tomorrow night against USC, it looks like he'll be out. But, Joe, I unfortunately do not think it's a coincidence that their 2 best defensive efforts have come with him off the floor. He is playing the 4 when he's on the floor, and he is not a good defender anyway against 5s. It allows Ballo to really play as the sweeping rim protector. It allows their guards a little bit more ball pressure. And then that's just the defensive end, Joe, which I think it is a big help. On the offensive end, Ballo's given all this room to operate. He's had 2 20-point games in Reneau's absence, and the shooters have gotten more open looks. And Renew is a great player, Joe, but at this point, it looks like Indiana might be a better team when it's Luke Goody and Mackenzie Mbako out there instead of Malik Renew.
Yeah, Sean, and that's the most exciting part. I think in a way they're similar to Michigan State. They have probably 8 or 9 guys that are starting caliber players in this conference. Unfortunately for Indiana, it's been Tom Izzo who's figured it out a lot quicker than Woodson and his staff. And I think Indiana right now, I'd say they're showing flashes of it, but it has to be a lot more consistent of a trend for me to call this an aberration on Indiana's part.
And Joe, the Nebraska game, if you had looked at the scoreboard, you see how Nebraska wins by 17. It was an easy win for them. Nebraska was up by 1 with 5 minutes left. Indiana was a couple minutes away from winning that game too. I think there's, Atlantis aside, that there was pathetic efforts down there and really didn't matter. But that Nebraska game's the only game that they've lost on United States soil. And we like to talk, Mike and I like to talk about UConn, their games in Hawaii where don't matter because they were all the way over there. But, this team put together a really good performance at Penn State. I was there in person. It's really evident how much of a leader Luke Goody is in person. He is always talking, whether he's on the floor, whether he's on the bench, talking to the assistants, talking to his teammates. More minutes for him is never going to be a bad thing. He hustles enough where defensively he's not a problem. And with Renew out, he is the obvious replacement to get 25 to 30 minutes a game, and he's probably the first or second best shooter here. He comes from a winning program, having played 3 years at Illinois. At least for now, Joe, it looks like Indiana is trending in the right direction. All right, Joe, we've got time for one more team here. And let's go with Illinois, just because they've been probably the most up and down team all year. They're 11-3, 3-1. They're my pick to win the league. In our most recent Power Rankings episode, we'll probably wait until the end of the college football playoff to do another one, just from a time point of view. We like getting those videos out if you haven't checked them out already. But, Joe, Illinois seems to be starting to reach their potential. They go on their West Coast trip. They go 2 for 2. After smoking Oregon, they get past Washington. At this point, Joe, long-term wise, you have to think Illinois is looking like the best team in the league.
I think best team in the league, and if the betting odds are reflected correctly, I do believe they're probably the closest favorite to winning it all. I don't want to check that right now, but if I were making the odds, I'd certainly put them there as well, because they have 3 stars on this team, and perhaps you can make an argument for Avicic too. I think Yakonis, Trey White, Kylan Boswell are guys that would be best players on most teams in the country. And the fact they're in one starting lineup is pretty scary. And then you take into account you have Will Riley, Jake Davis off the bench. I really don't understand how this team started off so poorly, besides the freshman factor. I mean, that was a given. But to go 2-0 on that road trip, and a lot of people are going to call it the Washington game as concerning. I thought the second half they just played bad for too many 2-minute stretches and allowed that game to get closer than it should have been. I thought if the first half just carried over into the second, it was going to be even more of an Illinois domination than it should have been. So, Illinois, probably right now, I know I've ridden with UCLA most of the year. If I had to pick a second team or repick, I'd probably pick Illinois to win this conference. Just the way they could score, the way they run the floor. And there's too many guys, Sean, that shoot too well. That's as blatant as it gets in basketball sometimes.
Joe, I think the system and Brad Underwood are, really should be taking a lot of the credit for this. Obviously, the freshmen have come in and have really progressed in half a season. Also, when it comes to Kylan Boswell and Trey White, these guys played other places. They were fine players, but nowhere near what they're doing right now. They were okay. Kylan Boswell was an okay player on a really good team, and Trey White was a good player on an awful team. So I just think that the pieces seem to be fitting here. Yakashonis is probably in the running for Conference Player of the Year at this point. I would say him and Williams are leading the way. Maybe Braden Smith too, if Purdue can finish near the top of the league. But there were a lot of questions about would the puzzle pieces fit here, Joe, and at least so far, they are. Their defense actually ranks better than their offense, which is something because that wasn't the case early on. And so far, so good for Brad Underwood and the Illini. And you have to think with their schedule, they're going to win a lot of games, at least in the immediate future.
Yeah, Sean, and this is a team that right now I'm just going to point something out in the standings, and I think it's pretty significant. So, just counting up the teams here. So I know Michigan, Indiana, Michigan State. I'm counting the undefeated teams at home. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right now, 6 of the 18 teams are undefeated at home. Very few have more than one loss at home, and I know that includes a lot of cupcake non-conference. But the point I'm trying to make about Illinois with that statement is this is a team in a lot of road games, even against ranked teams, like even against the Michigan State, who they have on who they have next Sunday. They're probably going to be favored in that game, which is pretty shocking. You know, Nebraska, which is taking care of a lot of business, probably on track to do so tonight. Hopefully, I don't jinx them in the moment. They'll probably be favored there as well. So, Sean, I think the analytics respect Illinois. The eye test, they certainly passed by now. And talent-wise, I don't think that's been in doubt. The only thing that's been in doubt is how good they can actually be. And right now, this team's ceiling gets larger and gets taller and taller, which is scary.
And their only loss, Joe, they do have a loss at home, but it's to the number one team in the country who, until today, haven't lost all year. Now they're getting their asses handed to them by Florida, but there's no shame in losing that. You'd have to think Illinois should probably be favored against anybody in the country at home. And Joe, like you said, I do think that they're probably favored against all but like 4 or 5 teams on the road. It's just they're super. Well, Florida beats Tennessee by 30. That just went final. But Illinois looks really good. I think they're probably my pick to win the league right now, Joe. But even if they don't, I think they're still the best team overall. And whether there's a tiebreaker or they lose by a game, I think that might have something to do with the schedule. But they're in good shape. Joe, you have to think a lot of teams in this league are in good shape to make the tournament. I think we're looking at a serious potential to have 10 teams in the tournament in this league. I haven't done a bracketology projection yet. I'm maybe Friday if I get some time, but other than maybe 4 or 5 teams, a lot of teams think they'll have a chance to hear their name called.
At least 13 are in contention, Sean. The only 5 I'll rule out right now is probably Minnesota, Rutgers, Washington, USC, and Iowa. But other than that, even Maryland, who I know is in, I think it's 14th or 15th place right now, or at least tied for that. Even them, I could see them getting in because of the significant non-conference they've had. So certainly a lot on the table, a lot to play for these teams. And for the 4 or 5 I've mentioned, 3 of those 5 are quad 3 or 4 losses. So not teams you want to tune out from necessarily.
So Joe, just a Ken Palm check here. We've got, again, there was that whole mob of teams in there from 20 to 40. Mob is slightly moving up. We've got 11 Illinois, 14 Michigan, 17 Michigan State, 18 Purdue, 21 UCLA, 22 Wisconsin, 25 Maryland, 28 Oregon, 32 Ohio State, 33 Nebraska, 39 Penn State, Northwestern at 52, Indiana at 54, Iowa at 55. Joe, that is a lot of teams in the top 55. That is 14 of the 18 teams in the top 55. And Ken Palm's a little different than the net, but 50 is the magic number for neutral games to count as quad 1, so that'll be Big Ten tournament games. 75 for road games, 30 for home games, and to just have 3 teams outside the top 55 and they're in the 77 to 88 range. Joe, there's a chance that if there's a chance every away game could be quad 1 if those 3 teams could sneak into the top 75. But this league is in a really good spot overall. I think we're going to see a lot of roller coaster seasons from a bunch of different teams, and it's already getting excited for the Big Ten tournament. I know we got a lot of games to go, but until then, Joe, we're going to wrap this thing up unless you got anything else to add.
Nothing else, Sean. I would just say don't tune out to any of these teams because they're all going to matter at some point in your team's season.
Yep. So thank you, everybody, for tuning into this episode. Please check out our other videos if you haven't already, and we'll see you next